3,165 executions. One man. One guillotine he invented himself. Johann Reichhart was Nazi Germany's most prolific killer, personally beheading over 80 victims in a single night during Hitler's 1934 purge. But when the Reich collapsed in 1945, Allied forces made him do something that would haunt him until his death in 1972. They forced him to execute over 90 of the very Nazi masters he'd once served. The regime's headhunter became the instrument of its own destruction. At Landsberg Prison between 1946 and 1947, the blade he'd built for Hitler came down on Hitler's own men. Long before the swastika rose over Munich, Johann Reichhart was already a professional killer of men. He inherited the trade from 8 generations of Bavarian executioners, and in 1928 he became the state's chief headsman, a civil servant of death, paid roughly 500 Reichsmarks a month, a wage comparable to a skilled engineer. Then, Hitler seized power in January 1933, and the quiet craft of a Bavarian functionary became an industrial operation. Reichhart, ever the technician, redesigned the guillotine itself, stripping weight, speeding the drop, shortening the interval between condemned prisoners to mere minutes. The German press would christen him the headhunter. For comparison, France's chief guillotiner, Jules-Henri de Fourneau, carried out roughly 300 executions across the same war years. Reichhart would surpass that figure 10 times over. But his most infamous night was June 30th, 1934. On the morning of June 30, 1934, Hitler launched the purge that history would call the Night of the Long Knives, and the blade he chose was Reichhart's. Inside Munich's Stadelheim prison, over the course of a single bloody stretch, the executioner worked through more than 80 condemned men, most of them senior officers of the SA, the brown-shirted street army that had carried Hitler to power. Among them stood Ernst Röhm, Hitler's oldest comrade, the man who had built the SA from beer hall brawlers into a force of millions. Röhm had refused to shoot himself in his cell, so Reichhart's machine did the work instead. The ideological justification was thin, accusations of a coup that never existed, but the strategic logic was absolute. The SS under Himmler and Heydrich needed the SA removed from power permanently. The purge eliminated Hitler's rivals inside his own party and cleared the path for the machinery of genocide that would follow. By sunrise, Reichhart had sent a message that would shake the entire country. The revolution now devoured its own founders. And this was only the beginning. Over the next 11 years, the vast majority of his 3,165 lifetime executions would be carried out under the swastika, processed through the courtrooms of the Volksgerichtshof, and delivered to his blade in places like Plötzensee and Brandenburg. But Reichhart wasn't just killing Hitler's enemies. The regime had bigger plans for his blade. While Reichhart operated the guillotine, men in suits designed the policies that fed it. On January 20th, 1942, Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller sat at the Wannsee Conference outside Berlin, where 15 senior officials formalized the final solution, converting scattered atrocities into a continental extermination program. 2 years later, Müller issued the so-called Cartridge Directive, ordering the execution of recaptured Soviet prisoners of war as secret bearers whose knowledge could not be allowed to escape. Reichhart never signed such papers. He simply received the bodies those papers produced. But the blade did not discriminate by ideology. When officers inside the Wehrmacht finally turned on Hitler during the July 20th, 1944 plot, Reichhart's workload only grew. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel arrested 1,200 SS and Gestapo members in a matter of hours, convinced the Führer was dead and the war could end. The plot collapsed within a day. Stülpnagel was dragged back to Berlin, tried at the Volksgerichtshof, and executed at Plötzensee Prison, the same facility where hundreds of conspirators met piano wire and guillotine alike. The regime killed its architects of resistance with the same efficiency it reserved for Jewish families, Soviet captives, and foreign laborers caught stealing bread. Reichhart's guillotine served all of them without distinction. May 1945. The Americans needed an executioner. May 1945 brought surrender, and Reichhart expected a rope of his own. Instead, the Americans arrived with a proposition. Allied authorities at Landsberg Prison, the same fortress where Hitler had written Mein Kampf 2 decades earlier, needed someone who could carry out the death sentences handed down at the Dachau trials. They needed volume, precision, and a man who would not flinch. Reichhart fit every requirement. Between 1946 and 1947, he guillotined and hanged over 90 convicted Nazis on behalf of the victors. Among them was Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, the bureaucrat who managed the slave labor and financial machinery of the concentration camps. Among them was Arthur Greiser, Gauleiter of the Wartheland, the man who had supervised the liquidation of Polish Jewry in the Łódź region. Compare this to Britain's Albert Pierrepoint, who hanged 756 people across his career, including top Nazis condemned at Nuremberg and Hameln. Pierrepoint traveled to Germany as a foreign executioner, an outsider delivering foreign justice. Reichhart killed his former masters on German soil, with German equipment, in German uniforms he had once saluted. When American hangmen botched Wilhelm Keitel's execution at Nuremberg, the chief of Wehrmacht High Command, who signed the 1942 commando order, the contrast grew sharper still. Reichhart's drops were clinical. His blade did not miss. Then, in 1947, the executions ceased. The Allies no longer required his services, and Reichhart returned to civilian life in Bavaria, carrying the weight of 3,165 executions across 3 regimes. Reichhart performed his final execution in 1949 for the new Bavarian state, before West Germany abolished capital punishment. He retired to a village outside Munich, where neighbors shunned him, and his wife eventually left him. He spoke openly in later interviews about being haunted, not by the Nazis he had killed for the Allies, but by the thousands of ordinary prisoners, deserters, resistance members, and foreign laborers whose deaths he had processed for the Reich. Denazification courts classified him a follower rather than a perpetrator. He drew a state pension. He lived freely until his death in 1972 at age 78. Meanwhile, Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief who engineered the paperwork of the Holocaust, was last seen in the Führer bunker on May 1, 1945, and vanished without trace, his body never identified, his fate never confirmed. Reichhart drew a pension. Müller vanished. The executioner who served 2 opposing regimes died in his own bed, while the men who drafted the orders he carried out either swung from his rope or slipped the net entirely. Reichhart killed for fascism, then killed for democracy, and the blade never cared which hand lowered it. His story is not redemption, it's a mirror. History's darkest chapters rarely end with justice balanced. They end with paperwork filed, pensions paid, and a village that stops speaking to the quiet old man next door.